So a few years back here at Genesis, we used to make videos, they tried to have me be a part of those, and we found out while we made those videos that I can be a little awkward in front of a camera. I feel pretty comfortable in front of a room, but they would try to make the videos, and Nick and Brandon Allen, Brandon is with us now, but Nick, his brother, used to lead worship here at Genesis, used to make fun of me because of how awkward I would seem in front of a camera. So not really sure how this will go. Even in the first video, you heard I have kids and dogs and in the background and all kinds of things going on in the house. But what I hope to do this morning is to open the scriptures and interact with this story in Daniel chapter 1. It's a very interesting story that on face value looks like Daniel is choosing a vegan diet. And maybe all of us should do the same. In fact, a few years back, a pretty famous pastor wrote a book that laid out the plan that is here in Daniel chapter 1 is God's ideal for our eating habits. And while I don't think it's a bad idea to eat more vegetables and drink more water, personally don't want to be a vegan, but know a lot of people choose that pathway, and if that's the way you go, that's fantastic. This text is not about that. And so first thing we want to do is, if you haven't read our text for today, I want you to pause this video, grab your family, look up our two passages of scripture, and have someone read them. The first one is Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 21. And the second passage is Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 1 through 14. So take a few minutes right now, look those up, pause this video if you haven't already done this, look those two passages up, and have someone in your family read them. And then after you've read them, come back and we will pick up the sermon to your family with what I think God is saying to us through this in just a minute. So go ahead and read those now. If you're not aware, I'm an 80s movie fan, and my favorite movie of all time is actually the original Ghostbusters. And while a lot of you may not have seen it, it's a classic. The old Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd and that crew who were about catching ghosts. And there's a scene in the movie where they're about to go into a big ballroom to catch this ghost with their neutron packs, which basically are like a giant gun that they can capture and detain ghosts with. And as they're going into the room, they get an important safety warning from Egon in the story, one of the characters, who tells them not to cross the streams, that each of them will shoot out a stream of bright light that will wrap around the ghost, but they are not to cast the streams. And so what they find out is that if they cross the streams, as he says, that every particle in their body will explode at the speed of light. And they call it total protonic reversal if they cross the streams. I was thinking this week and actually talking to a friend about what we're talking about today. And he was talking about the fact that in his life, that's been a challenge, that he has this stream that is the stream of his church life, the stream of his family life, the stream of his school life when he was in college. And then eventually he went into the working world and had the stream of his business life. And for a long time, it was easy to keep those streams separate. It was easy to say, you know, this stream is my family life, this stream is my business life, this stream is my church life. But things started happening in his life with especially where he was working, where those streams started to cross. And for him, it became a point of tension, something that became very hard at first. But gradually, he really became to understand that this was actually God's doing, that God was kind of causing those streams to cross. And while at the moment it felt like total protonic reversal and that every molecule in his body might have been exploding at the speed of light, the truth of the matter is it was a moment for him that he realized that God was up to something in his life and that he was to see his place in his business as more than just a job, more than just a way to make money. It was really a place where God had placed him intentionally for the purpose of the kingdom and the cause of the mission and God's purpose in his life. So while it does provide a paycheck, he also realized that his placement in his business and his placement among his friends and other streams of his life were all intentional, and that really God's design is for us to cross these streams. To actually engage people in our world, to engage the structures over us engage our authorities, our bosses, our teachers, our principals, realizing that God has placed us in those moments to be a representative of himself and display his goodness, his glory, his character as he works in our lives by applying the gospel. Now, this means that we believe in Jesus and that Christ is changing our lives. And so all messages we have start with the gospel, that God loves us, he is for us, but that we are sinners and broken people who need redemption and rescue, and that God has come in the person of Christ, given his son, and that by doing that, by dying on the cross and rising again, God offers us new life, he offers us hope, and he offers us redemption. And then as redeemed people, God starts transforming us from the inside out, but he puts us in a world that doesn't hold our belief systems, doesn't stand with us on our values, that sees the world differently than we do. How do we engage that world? Well, the theme in Daniel is all about living as exiles, living as people who are actually citizens of one kingdom, but living and serving in a totally different kingdom. Daniel and his friends had lived in Israel. They had been to the temple in Jerusalem. They were part of the king's royal family or part of his royal court. They were young men, probably teenagers at the time. And then Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, conquered the city of Israel, or the nation of Israel, and the city of Jerusalem, and deported them, made them travel by foot hundreds and hundreds of miles to a different kingdom. And now they are in Babylon, and they are citizens of Jerusalem, but they are living in Babylon. And for Daniel and his three closest friends here in this story, they are not only living in Babylon, but they are in the king's court. They're going to be educated at their most prestigious university. They're going to go through learning the literature and the values and the attitudes of the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar's goal was twofold. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, wanted to get these people into Babylon. He wanted to get them out of their country and into Babylon. By getting them into Babylon, this meant that they would be able to serve his kingdom. They would be able to live in Babylon. They would increase the economic development and the power and the strength of the Babylonian kingdom. He wanted to get them into Babylon. But the second goal for Nebuchadnezzar was to get Babylon into them, to have the cultures, the beliefs, the attitudes, the values, the religious worldview of Babylon to sink into the lives of these exiles, so that while they may be Jewish in nationality, eventually they would embrace all that is Babylon, even the religious worldview. And he does this in a few ways. If you have it, I'm gonna look down at my text here. I want us to look up at the verses preceding our text, starting with verse 4. He says that Daniel and his friends, they were to find youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, competent to stand in the king's palace. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar wanted his leaders to find people who were young men, young leaders, who had the ability to stand in the king's presence. In other words, they were intelligent, they were skillful in what they did, and able to serve the king. And then it says here, and they were to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. They were to learn the language of Babylon, but not just the language, the literature of Babylon. Or in other words, we're going to indoctrinate you. We're going to teach you our beliefs. We're going to put you in school. It says later that they're going to do this for 3 years. They're going to study and learn for 3 years before they actually serve the kingdom. And it said the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. And so among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. We're told that these are men who come from the tribe of Judah. This is the same tribe that Jesus will come from. It is the kingly line, and now they are in Babylon, and they have gotten them out of Israel into Babylon. But the king's goal is to get Babylon into them. That's his purpose. And so their names even represent something. All of the names of these young men have the name of their one true and living God as part of it. For example, the name Daniel literally means God is my judge. But notice what they do. Verse 7, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. They changed their names, which was an attempt to actually change their core identity to help them move from being worshipers of the one true God. Each of the new names have a name of one of the many deities that are worshipped in Babylon as part of it. So they are giving up their name that has their God in the name and replacing it with names, with identities that are now part of the spirituality, the belief system, the values of Babylon. And so, for example, Daniel, whose name meant God is my judge, is now going to be named Belshazzar, which means Bel is the one who prospers and cares for my life. Bel is the one who protects me. Bel was one of the Babylonian gods. And so it was an attempt to literally change their name. And so the question is, how do we live in a culture that this is kind of what's going on? Our culture is doing this. It's doing it in ways to us. It's doing it in ways to our kids. That the more we live in our time at this point in time, the more we realize that our culture is no longer sympathetic with our Christian beliefs, our understanding of who God is, but more and more is seeing us as people that need to be indoctrinated, changed, to embrace a different way of seeing the world belief system if we're going to stay in this culture. And for many of you, you're seeing this in your school, as you were being presented with even assignments and the way that the classroom it presents values and attitudes in the world. A lot of you have conflicts that go on like this in your place of employment as you are trying to work for a company and you have maybe a boss or maybe a whole work culture that is not in any way honoring to God, and you have these points of conflict that show up in this story this morning, very much Daniel, his friends, and the diet they are offered. And what happens is when we hit these moments, there are different ways we can respond to a culture when we are in exile. When we are people who are servants and living, seeking to live, knowing that we're redeemed and rescued people, knowing that we've been loved by Christ and honored by him. But now we live in a world that doesn't believe what we believe, and not only doesn't believe, but really wants us to have Babylon come into us. That it's a world where we are in Babylon, but the world doesn't see that as enough. The world wants Babylon to get into us. How do we interact with that world? And some people will respond with what I will call today separatism. That what we do is we see this as a adversarial relationship, that it's us against the world, that we're going to pull back, we're going to kind of come with a posture of our hands up, ready for a fight. We see this as a cultural war, that it's us versus them, and we pull to ourselves. We may work in the world, we may interact with the world, but we also tend to see the world as our enemy. We tend to see Babylon as the problem, and that we need to stand against Babylon in kind of a combative, separatist, distant way. We form holy communities that huddle to themselves, and boy, the goal is there's no way we are getting Babylon into us. But at the same time, by doing so, the truth is we actually are never really in Babylon. We're never really part of what is going on in the world around us. We end up just kind of screaming at the culture rather than being actively engaged in the culture and loving the culture and interacting with the culture. Another approach that you might see and that many Christians throughout the world will take often is, ending up being involved in syncretism. So there's separatism and then there's syncretism. Syncretism is that just a little bit at a time, over a period of time, we become more and more like the cultures, that the amenities of the cultures, the good food and drink of the culture, the wonderful entertainment of the culture, the way we're taught in the culture, gradually over the time, we just more and more embrace the values, the attitudes, the beliefs, the worldview, the recreational things that the culture offers, and they just become more and more part of our lives, so that over a long period of time, we get to a point where we're not only in Babylon, but Babylon is deeply into us. This might represent people, there's people who may be very active in a church, But that is just a part of their life that's over here in terms of who they really are, the way they live in the world, the way they interact with their business. No matter what goes on, they just kind of gradually have given into temptations, given into things that would push back against their faith, and gradually their system of ethics, their values and attitudes are more shaped by their workplace or the larger culture than by the gospel. And this is very dangerous. So these people, like we can end up where we were both in Babylon, but Babylon is deeply in us, and we lose our ability to be salt and light to the culture. Another way that you might, people might respond, I'm going to call silentism or secretism today. And this, what I'm saying here, what we're trying to say is that for a lot of people, it's not that we are separatists. We're not pulling away from the culture and seeing them as an enemy. We're not syncretists. We're not, doing the things the world does and embracing their beliefs. We just go silent. We become mannequin man who just stands in the corner and never moves when something awkward or difficult is in the room. We don't engage the culture, that when the food is offered to us, we find a way never to raise the issue, never to interact with the challenge. But when our beliefs are confronted, we just go silent. We don't give in and we don't pull away. We're just silent. And I don't think either one of those three responses are what Daniel pictures for us and what the gospel calls us to. And so to understand this, I want us to think about the Jeremiah passage. The Jeremiah passage that we had you read today is a very interesting passage. The prophet Jeremiah has, from Israel, from Jerusalem, has written a letter to the exiles. The letter actually comes a few years after this event, but it represents God's purpose that I think Daniel and his friends are living out. And so the letter was written from the prophet Daniel to the exiles. The exiles had started hearing false prophets who told them that this was just a hiccup, that God was on their side, that eventually they were getting out of Babylon. They were to live separatist lives while they were in Babylon, because their time in Babylon would be short, that they were going to be rescued and go home. And Daniel, speaking on behalf of God, who starts the letter that he writes to the exiles with this phrase, "Thus saith the Lord." This is what God is saying to you, lays out God's purpose for them in Babylon. And I think it is a purpose that what's being said here is a purpose that all of us in exile can see and can feel the weight of. And basically what Jeremiah tells them is that, first of all, that as they get in Babylon, they need to put down roots. They need to build houses. They need to get married. They need to have babies. They need to live in Babylon. They need to put down roots. They can't live separatist lives. They need to move into neighborhoods. They need to buy their house. They need to live in these cities. They need to see that Babylon is going to be their home, and not just for a short season. He tells us prophetically that it's going to be 70 years that they're going to be in Babylon. In other words, the generation that is alive reading this letter will never go home for the most part. They will never leave Babylon. They are going to be in Babylon. That Nebuchadnezzar's goal of getting them into Babylon is also God's purpose for them. Verse 4 says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles," listen to this phrase, "whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." That God is the one who orchestrated this. And we know from the story, from this text, from Daniel, that God had orchestrated this in their lives first for the purpose of disciplining his own people for their rebellion, for their sin, for their brokenness, so that he could bring them back to himself, and they would be people who are lived as rescued and loved people. That part of the way that they're going to experience the love of God is through the discipline of God. We know this as parents, that when our kids run away from us, it is a loving act to lovingly discipline our children. Not to be abusive, but to lovingly discipline our children, because we understand what is best. And for the Hebrew people, what was best for them was their God. It's also what's best for us, that what is best for us is the gospel in our lives, to love Christ deeply, to taste and drink from the well of Christ, to know him fully. That is what's best for us. And so for Daniel and or for the exiles, God's love is being expressed through this discipline. But it's also God's intention to put agents of the gospel in Babylon so that his glory is on display in Babylon. That is God's intention. And so he tells them, I put you there. And notice what he says. He tells them build houses, to get married, and all this sort of stuff. And then look at verse 7. This is the key verse I want you to see. He says, but seek the welfare of this city where I have sent you. There it is again. I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf for its welfare, and find in its welfare you will find your welfare. He says, listen, seek the welfare. I love that word. The word in the original language is actually the word shalom. It is the word that we get peace from. To this day, if you were in a Hebrew culture, the greeting on the street that you would greet one another would not be hello. It would be shalom, or peace to you. But it's more than just, hey, I hope you don't get in a fight today. I hope you don't get, like I hope that war doesn't break out. That's not the only idea. It's part of it. It's not the only idea. It's actually, for the Hebrews, their understanding of peace was wholeness, being all that God intended you to be full, to be blessed, to be honored by God, that your relationship with God would be right, and therefore your relationship with the world around you would be right as well. And he says, listen, what you need to do is you need to seek shalom, peace, the welfare of Babylon, not of Jerusalem, of Babylon. And you should pray for the welfare, for the shalom of Babylon, because in its welfare is your welfare. In its peace is your peace. He goes on to explain to him how to do this. Don't listen to the prophets who are telling you to be a separatist, and don't be drawn into Babylon so that you were just part of the culture, but you were to be in Babylon for Babylon, but your allegiance is not to the gods and the objects of worship of Babylon. Your allegiance and your hope and your trust is in the one true and living God. And so he says, listen, this is going to be a 70-year process of God doing this work in and through you in that city. So what does that mean for us? It means that we live in Eureka. We have jobs that are around St. Louis County and St. Louis City, that the larger region of St. Louis is where we're at. We're in this culture that is the United States and the larger American culture. And the larger American culture has idols and has attitudes and values and things that they believe in. And that God, just like the Hebrews were in Babylon, that God has placed us in this city, in this place, that this is not our true home, that we are citizens of a better, truer kingdom. But we are to seek the peace of Babylon, that we are to seek the peace, the shalom of Eureka, that we are to seek the peace, the shalom of our school, and to pray for it. We are to seek the peace, the shalom of our place of work and the place that God has placed us to earn our income. But we're to realize that we are there for way more than just to learn from teachers or to earn a paycheck or to advance a business cause. That is important, that we're to build houses and get married and do life in our city. But in a greater way, God has placed us in this place so that we can actually seek the peace of the places that he has put us. That we are to be in Babylon, but Babylon is not to get into us. That we are to live and serve in Babylon, but ultimately our allegiance is to Christ and his gospel and his commands and his purpose in our life, and that we are to see ourselves as people living out that purpose, as light, as salt, as loving images of people who've been transformed by the gospel wherever we've put us. And that's why this story is so important. Because in the midst of this story, what we have is the fact that Daniel and his friends are offered the king's table. They go to school. They do the learning. They are willing to go and hear what the Babylonian culture has to say about their language. They learn the Babylonian language. They read the Babylonian culture. They go to the Babylonian university. They are learning the culture. They're studying the belief systems. They are hearing about their gods. But when it comes to the king's table, something else happens. And I think there's two big issues that are going on here for Daniel and his friend. Two reasons where it says Daniel, he resolves himself not to defile himself, and all of a sudden food becomes this major issue. And I think both of them have to do with the idea of that they are to be in Babylon, but they're not to let Babylon get into them. The first issue is this, that as Jewish young men, they have the Old Testament law that God has laid out that is part of their worship. And the Old Testament law prescribed very specific laws about the things they can and can't eat. It included certain types of food. So the Old Testament law told them they couldn't eat things like catfish or fish that didn't have scales, that they could not eat pork and other types of meat. There were certain types of vegetables and other greens that they could eat and some that they couldn't. And the truth of the matter is, when the king is making the meal and the king is not Jewish, they may get all kinds of different things that may or may not be clean or unclean food. But not only in the clean or unclean food issue was the type of meat, but how it was prepared was also important. There were all kinds of laws that even for the meat that they would eat, it had to be prepared in a certain way. Believe it or not, it had to be slaughtered and cared for in a certain way. And it wasn't just that they could eat beef, but even if they were going to eat beef or chicken or other types of meat, as they were eating that meat, it had to be prepared in a very specific way to honor the laws of God. Even to this day, this is true in Jewish culture. We hear about kosher food. That it's still the idea that comes from the Old Testament law of the types of food they can eat, but also how that food was prepared. And I guarantee you the Babylonian king didn't care about making anything that was kosher. So when they sat down at the table, they would have food offered to them that came from the king's table. It was the best food, the best wine, but they could not eat that in any way knowing whether or not that food had them violating and breaking the laws of God. But I think there's a second issue that is also important in this text, and that is the fact that there is eating at the king's table and eating the king's food is a picture of deep prosperity that's being offered to these boys if they will just cave. That by coming to the table, there's something about eating and drinking with people and having food offered to you that is rich and wonderful, that is very seductive, that is very drawing. And in this case, I really believe that what's happening here is that Daniel and his friends are being invited to a table that is a direct way for Babylon sinking into them. So not only would they deny the laws of God and just a little bit at a time cave on what God had clearly told them they can and can't do, but a little bit at a time they would begin to embrace the luxury and the deep values that come from Babylon as they sat at the table and ate the king's food. Just one bite at a time, being syncretized, being drawn in, one bite at a time, becoming part of Babylon, one bite at a time, caving in on their beliefs, just a little bit here and there. Very much like an old story, I don't know if it's true or not, but they say that if you threw a frog into a boiling pot, it would immediately jump out. But if you take a frog and put it into a kettle that's room temperature water and just a little bit at a time turn up the temperature, that frog will get very comfortable in that water until eventually that water gets so hot that it would boil it to death, but it would never move. And very much like that, just 1 degree at a time, being absorbed into Babylon. And the food issue here is a picture of Daniel and his friends saying, listen, we're going to live in Babylon. We're going to serve this king. We're going to read your literature. We're going to speak your language. But we are not going to give up our identity. We are not going to end up serving this king. And I really think that's the crux of this story. It will be lived out in the rest of the book of Daniel as Daniel and his friends have moments in the story over a long period of years where they're told that to go on, to continue in this town, you must bow to an idol. You must stop praying. You must become Babylonian. And at those moments, Daniel and his friends have to stand up and say, nope, we will stay true to our God. But the rest of the time, what's really interesting in Daniel is that Daniel it really ends up covering 70 years of history in a few chapters and only highlights a few stories. So what's going on in between those stories? And the answer is that Daniel and his friends are faithfully serving in Babylon. They have built houses. They are living their lives, and they're actually serving the king of Babylon. They are in his court. Daniel gets very close to the seat of power in Babylon. But he always knows who his true king and his true kingdom is. And that's the issue. And as they do that, God has chosen to prosper them. God has chosen to bless them. God has chosen to take care of them. I've been thinking a lot about this week and just listening to stories and wrestling with how do we live in this world, and realizing that that there are just points in our lives where the culture at large or our place of work may push us into situations where it is very difficult to know what to do. It's very difficult. Do I just give in a little bit so that this doesn't become pressure-filled and tension and get me ostracized, fired, in trouble, a bad grade? Or do I at this moment say, nope, I have to honor my God? And sometimes it's very hard to know, am I really crossing lines or not? Well, Daniel gives us a picture of this. I've been thinking about this friend of mine that I talked to this week that just talked about the fact that in his business of sales, one of the primary ways that the type of people that he's selling to, it's a construction business and he does sales for construction, and the type of business that he's involved in, literally the best way to get in is to take the men to restaurants like Hooters or a place that's just not appropriate. It's just kind of common practice. And he's had to wrestle with the fact that as a follower of Jesus, what does it look like to, make sure that he doesn't just embrace that? Because he could probably sell more and do better in his job if he would do that. But in the end, he knows that he just can't go there as a follower of Jesus. And it's created conversations even in his own workplace that have pressed him, that have kind of put him on a spot. But in the end, he's had opportunities to have conversations about his relationship with Christ, and about the values that flows. And so he continues to do all he can to sell all he can, to be a good employee, to serve his company, to make his paycheck. But he knows that there's places where the tension between following Jesus and living in Babylon do come to a head. Think of just all kinds of other situations this happens. And so what we see is the beauty of this text. And this morning, just kind of closing real fast, I'm just going to point out 7 things that Daniel and his friends do in this text that show us what it might look like if we are gospel people, that Christ has changed us living in this culture, to be in Babylon, to pray for the welfare, the peace, to live for the shalom of our city, our region, our nation, our place of employment, our school, while at the same time being reminded that God has placed us here. He is purposeful, and our allegiance is to Christ, and that God is making his glory known and putting it on display in our lives as we live in Babylon, but we are faithful to Christ's kingdom. And so here we go. 7 things that we see in this text. Hit them real quick that Daniel and his friends do. First of all, we see that Daniel never forgot his identity. I love that it lays out in verse 7 the new names of Daniel and his friends. But notice in verse 8 he says, but Daniel. Not but Belshazzar, but Daniel resolved. In other words, Daniel knows who he is. He knows that God is his God, that he is part of God's redeemed community, that he may be in Babylon, but Babylon is not getting into him. And while the Babylonians may give him a new name, because the truth is that from that day on, the Babylonians and the people in the Babylonian court are going to call them by their Babylonian name. That's the identity the Babylonians are going to give them. But for Daniel knows his true identity is in the God who is his judge and who is for him and who has rescued him and redeemed him and who has placed him in this situation. Daniel knows that is his identity. And it's really hard for us. Our identity gets wrapped up in so many things, but we need to be drawn back to the fact that our identity is in Christ. Second, we see that he resolved to honor God. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. Daniel is putting his foot down and saying, listen, there are lines that I can't cross. We will never get there if we don't know what those lines are. This is where the importance of Scripture in our lives, of our community of faith, of being in community, having dialogues with our community group and saying, I got this going on at work and I'm not sure where the line is. Can you help me pray about this and think about this and figure this out? It's where opening the Scriptures and seeing what God has said is so important. It's why rhythmic preaching of God's Word in your church is so important, as the Scriptures are being poured into your life on a week-to-week basis and interpreted and shared, and the gospel is proclaimed. That we'll never know how to resolve to honor God if we don't really know what God has to say to us about certain situations, certain ethics, certain belief systems, certain values. And so we see that Daniel knew what this meant and knew where to put his foot down. Notice he didn't put his foot down at reading the literature or to hearing the stories or to engaging the Babylonians. Honor not a separatist, but there were points in the story where Daniel said, nope, doing that means that I would dishonor my God. And so he was resolved to honor God. Third thing here is that he recognized God's sovereignty in his daily destination. And I'm using that phrase, daily destination, right here to talk about your place of work, or if you go to school, or if you're part of like organizations that you work with or serve on, maybe the PTO or the Eureka Sports Association, things like that. There are places that we were just rhythmically involved on. And what I'm saying here is that Daniel, his place was the king's court. And he recognized that God had put him there. That it wasn't just by chance he ended up in this situation, that it was God's purposeful goal to have him there. And so he recognized God's sovereignty, which means that while he may not have understood the purpose God had for him, God did have a purpose both in his life, but also through his life to Nebuchadnezzar. And that will show up in the rest of this book. He recognized God's sovereignty in his daily situation. He realized it was God who had put him in this place. Fourth thing, he genuinely cared for those around him. That's important. As you read this story, you see this person who is called the king's eunuch. And he comes with the food. He is the person who is put in authority over Daniel and his friends, these young men, and he serves them the food. And Daniel looks at him and says, we can't eat this. Now, at first, it sounds like Daniel's being a separatist, throwing up and saying, we're backing away, we're not having a thing to do with this. But notice that what happens in the story is that this person looks at Daniel and says, man, I'm going to go back to the king. He literally says, the king will have my head. That's not figurative. If I don't obey the king and give you this food, I will be the one who gets in trouble and literally has to die because you're not doing this. And I love the fact that the plan Daniel comes up with literally is a way for Daniel and his friends to seek to honor God, but he doesn't throw this person under the table. He cares for him. He wants what's best for him. And I think in the end, Daniel is knowing that he has a chance to love and serve this person who has authority over him. Ultimately, he's going to have to wrestle with, does he obey this authority or does he obey God's authority? But he comes up with a very good plan that hopefully helps him honor God while not getting this other person in trouble. I also think we can assume from the text that after 10 days, if it hadn't gone well, that the end result would be that it's not this man who forfeits his head, but it's Daniel and his friends. That he's not going to cost this person his life. It's really going to be Daniel and his friends who will stand before the king and say, we refuse to dishonor God. Do with us what you will. And so he cares for those around him. He sees them as people, and he doesn't see them as the enemy. Number 5 here, he expected Babylonians to be, well, Babylonians. There's not the expectation here that everybody lays aside the king's food and eats vegetables and drinks water. This is something that they, as Hebrews in that culture, felt like they needed to do. This is so important in understanding what I'm trying to say to you this morning. So often in the Christian world, we get angry at people in our culture at people who aren't Christians for not acting like Christians. We think it's their job to uphold our values, morals, and attitudes. And that is a misunderstanding of the gospel. God did not place us here so that we could convince the culture to believe what we believe in a way that says we have our rights and our freedoms And that's the most important thing. He's placed us in a culture that doesn't believe, so that our lives lived differently will literally be an image of God's grace and mercy in our lives. And so Daniel and his friends loved the Babylonians, but they're not expecting the Babylonians to act like Hebrews. Rather, they're going to live like Hebrews in Babylon. They're going to be in Babylon, but not let Babylon get into them, which means their lives will be different. But they are not angry or hateful to the Babylonians for acting like Babylonians. We have a lot of growing of this in our culture. We should not be showing up in classrooms yelling and screaming at teachers, which I've seen happen over and over again, like on college campuses, because teachers believe in evolution or hold an ethic in the classroom that doesn't look like it is Christian. What we need to do is figure out how to love those people, but realize that they are acting like people who don't have a relationship with the living God, and that God has placed us in those spaces to be a representation of Him by loving them, while at the same time standing for things that are clear in what God has called us to be. Number 6, he formed a plan and took responsibility for the plan. We see this in the text that Daniel doesn't put it on the Babylonians to come up with a way to cater to him. He is the one, he and his friends are the ones who came up with the plan and formulated the plan that was the way for him to try to be resolved. At the same time, he would continue to benefit Babylon. And I love how the story fleshes out. The biggest miracle of the text here happens in verse 15, where it says, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. There's the miracle. People who become vegans got fatter. That's kind of funny, right? But what we see here is that God actually honored their choice in this moment, so that he could use them in that moment. We do need to realize that sometimes standing for our faith will be super costly. It doesn't always land this way, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. All right, last one, number 7. He remembered that his mission was more important than his job. We see this in verses 17 to the end of the chapter, that he was serving the king of Babylon, but he was truly serving Christ, or God, as his king. And by serving God as his king first, it put him in a place to do well for the king of Babylon, to live for its peace, for its shalom, for the king's peace, the king's shalom. And because of that, he was now in a position where God could use him, bless him, and make a difference to their lives. And so that's really the goal of this text. That's God's desire, is that we would first come to Christ, that we would know him, we would love him, that we live in a culture and we work in businesses and go to schools who have two goals. They want us to get into Babylon, but they want to get Babylon into us. And what we need to learn how to do is learn how to live in Babylon, to live in Eureka, live in our work, to have our jobs, to be part of those systems, to prosper them, to work hard, to be good employees, to be good students, to learn the systems, to learn the structures. But we also need to know where being in these spaces will cause us to have moments or places where to honestly do the things that we're being asked to do, go the places we're being asked to go, to eat the food or to digest the ideals, is actually stepping into places where they're asking us to bow to their idols, to serve their gods, to give up our ethics, to be disobedient to Christ. And when we come to those points, we need to find ways that are respectful, that honor who we work for or work with, that loves them and sees them as people, but also at the same time demonstrates that our allegiance is to Christ. And if I have to choose between my job and my walk with Jesus, I will choose my walk with Jesus, but I hope I don't have to. I hope I can continue to serve and love both Jesus, and because I love Jesus and I'm loved by him, can serve and love the people that I work with, and the people that I serve with, and the people I'm part of. And so for all of us, there's application here. It's a great story. When we finish here, my encouragement is go have lunch with your family. And if you're vegan, enjoy your vegetables. And if you're not, eat vegetables anyway. But more than that, in the end, that we honestly honor Christ in all that we do. And especially for us in the workplace and in our spaces in the world where we are serving. So love y'all. God bless. And hope this has been a good time for you. Spend a few minutes talking about this with your family, and we'll talk to you next week.